You okay? Len,
Yeah.
you okay?
This is my dear wife. Asked me whether I'm okay. Yes, I'm okay.
Do you want tea?
If I need anything,
Tea?
tea. Okay. Yeah.
Tea? Black?
Black tea. Okay. We are 1 minute to go, Kyle. Possibly what we can do is give people 1 spare minute, and then we'll just get started.
All right, I think I'm going to get us going, if that's all right. So welcome to you all. My name is Kyle Greenwald. I am an associate professor of teacher education at Michigan State University and the president of the John Dewey Society. On behalf of immediate past president Sarah Stitzlin and president-elect Barb Stengel, I'd like to thank you for coming to the John Dewey Society's Centennial Conference on the publication of Human Nature and Conduct. We're glad that you've joined us today. I want to start today by expressing my gratitude for the land that supports us all. Wherever you are, I'd ask you to join me in acknowledging the original inhabitants of the land. At Michigan State University, from where I'm joining you today, I want to give thanks to the Anishinaabe and the people of the Three Fires Confederacy who have been on this land since time immemorial. The purpose of the Society is to foster intelligent inquiry into problems pertaining to the place and function of education and social change, and to share, discuss, and disseminate the results of such studies. Today's event certainly speaks to that purpose. I'd like to give special thanks to our distinguished past president and longtime Dewey scholar and activist, Leonard for organizing this conference. Human Nature and Conduct is a fascinating book in Dewey's overall work, and I look forward to learning more from today's distinguished speakers. Len, I'll now turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Kyle, and welcome to everybody. The day will be divided into 2 panels. The first will discuss pragmatist ethics, and we'll place human nature and conduct in the context of that. Human nature and conduct is 100 years old. It's the Centennial. Speaking as a psychologist rather than a philosopher today, I would say that it's the basic principle is still sound and worthy of further development. The book has never really received the attention that I think it deserved. When you take an ethics course today, you're sure to learn about Aristotle, Hume, Kant, Mill, Bentham, but Dewey is not on the agenda typically. And I think his book was a challenging book, and I think in some ways much ahead of its time. Dewey actually is in communication with Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Bentham, and also Buddhist and other Oriental ethics throughout human nature and conduct, and he has original things to say about them. And as I mentioned earlier, Andrea and I are preparing a handbook on human nature and conduct, and we hope to have it out next year, by the end of next year. The first session will be a survey of pragmatist ethics, and the first speaker is Todd Lekan. Todd, take it away.
Thanks so much, Len. I want to give you a heartfelt thanks, and thanks to Kyle for organizing this conference. This is a great opportunity to meet with colleagues I haven't seen in a long time, and so I really appreciate that. And I enjoyed the opportunity to go back to HNC after some time, away from it. So this was helpful to me. Let me try to share my screen and see how that goes. Okay. So is everybody seeing a PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm going to be mindful of the time, and Len, you can crack the whip or, let me know if I'm going too far off field, but I do have my timer on. And so I'm going to, kind of run through this fairly quickly. I'm calling this Jamesian deposits in Dewey's ethical thought, kind of focusing on human nature and conduct. A little self-promotion here. I have a new book on James's ethics called William James and the Moral Life, Responsible Self-Fashioning. And in this book, I try to cull through James's writings and show that he has, in fact, a very defensible and comprehensive moral outlook that is comprised of kind of two philosophical perspectives: the moral philosopher who is concerned with existential concerns, matters of meaning, nihilism, free will, themes that many, point to in James, especially in the collection Will to Believe. But there's also a social moral philosopher perspective articulated in The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life that is committed to creating an inclusive ethical republic and overcoming moral blindness. And so those two perspectives, I argue in the book, comprise a defensible ethic. And I do find, affinities between James's ethics and Dewey, and in particular, this idea that moral inquiry is based in what we might call a participant standpoint. We are the subjects of moral inquiry, both collectively and individually. Moral inquiry is about fashioning character and self as well as community. And I think that's a coherent, solid theme in both James and Dewey. And one might put it as there's a deep continuity between the practice of moral philosophy, moral theorizing, and moral life. Those are continuous activities. So moral philosophy is a continuation of what's already going on in moral life. So here are a few themes that I want to just highlight in terms of affinities between James and Dewey, particularly the HNC Dewey. Both men obviously emphasize the need for a collaborative approach to moral philosophy, drawing on the best methods of arts and sciences. James is pretty clear about this in Moral Philosophy and Moral Life, and Dewey works this out in great detail in HNC and other writings. Both men are instrumentalist and fallibilists about theories, concepts, and essences, cautioning us against oversimplifications, particularly when we're talking about moral life. And I'll give you an example in Dewey in a second. But importantly, I really want to highlight the starting point of pragmatist moral inquiry, which is a complete rejection of the moral skeptic's challenge, why be moral? A challenge that, throughout the history of Western philosophy kind of assumes an agent who is, self-concerned, who is asocial and needs to be convinced that there are other regarding moral obligations, and that is the task of moral philosophy. I see in James and Dewey, and I'll give you a few quotes here in a second, a complete rejection of that. They don't even answer that skeptical challenge, but rather assume that we start from a standpoint of limited sympathy. The goal of moral philosophy is to overcome moral blindness. And this is grounded in what you might say is a social relational account of the self, well articulated in the principles of psychology, but also richly developed in HNC. Now, what I'm going to do at the end, and this is going to be, real quick, is highlight how this social relational self and starting point of moral inquiry feed into what I'm calling fifth wheel arguments in pragmatist ethics against a whole host of attempts to offer normative grounding for our practices. And that's going to be real quick. I'm trying to work out a paper on this in greater detail. So this is sharing with you some a work in progress. I do develop this a little bit in my book on James, but fifth wheel arguments basically say that, metaphysical or epistemological grounding assumptions do no real work in making sense of our engagement with moral practices. So more affinities between James and Dewey. Obviously, James gives Dewey a sort of starting point in habits as absolutely crucial for understanding human nature and indeed moral life. Dewey, I like to think of him as developing a count of habits as always comprised of ways of thinking, feeling, and doing in transaction with environing conditions. This is, to me, so well developed in human nature and conduct. And when I started working on pragmatist ethics, it was HNC that I was turning to most, especially this account of habits that you get in Dewey. You also get, a caution about simplifications and reductions to single motives or instincts. And Dewey is really good on this in HNC and even echoes some James on this particular notion. And nuanced accounts of moral transformation and a social relational account of the self. These are all themes that I think, I think they're deposits from James to Dewey and affinities as well. So let's start with just a nice example from HNC with respect to the theme of cautioning us against a simple reductionism and giving us a more nuanced approach to thinking about how we transform morally. And this is from pages 79 and 80 of HNC, where Dewey praises James for the essay Moral Equivalent of War. So here's Dewey saying, an immense debt is due to William James for the mere title of his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War. It reveals with a flash of light the true psychology. The suggestion of an equivalent of war calls attention to the medley of impulses which are casually bunched together under the caption of belligerent impulse. And it calls attention to the fact that the elements of this medley may be woven together into many different types of activity, some of which may function the native impulses in much better ways than war has ever done. And so I like that. And Dewey goes on, if you read the surrounding pages, to say, had James lived long enough to see the Great War, he probably would have acknowledged the need to revise his account, especially in light of the vast administrative apparatus of the state to mobilize the nation state for war, mass propaganda, and the sheer destructive force of modern weaponry. But even with that said, I think Dewey finds a great value in developing a more nuanced account of human nature, which would say, we don't have this simple belligerent impulse. What we have is a medley of habits that organize impulses in specific ways under very concrete conditions. And our task is to figure out ways of changing those conditions to change those habits. Mentioned this before, but here's some nice quotes to show affinities between James and Dewey on what you might think of as a relational account of the self. I think that, Dewey was a great admirer of the principles of psychology, as most people on this call know, and I think it really helped him move in a more naturalistic direction. So this is a nice quote, a few nice quotes from Dewey here. I own, therefore I am, expresses a truer psychology than the Cartesian I think, therefore I am. The self is understood in terms of those objects it identifies with, or to maybe use a Hegelian phrase, to those things it appropriates and takes in from the environment and expresses in the environment. James, in his famous account of the self and principle, says, in its widest possible sense, however, a man's self is the sum total of what he can call his. And both James and Dewey, use this sort of account to reject what you might think of as really simplistic sort of self-love theories of motivation. There's a quote here from James where he's like, we're not really after a self in a more primordial sense. We're just immersed in objects that we have, sort of emotional and affective attachments to. And you see Dewey making what you might think of as Butlerian arguments in his writings in HNC, saying the fact that the self is the bearer of and creator of motives or intentions hardly means those are the objects of intentions or motives. So you get this relational account of self. And of course, it's a social relational account. So James, often thought of as this individualist, but, he has a very richly social account of the self and principles of psychology. And this obviously will influence Dewey and Mead for that matter. A man's social self is the recognition which he gets from his mates, is from principles of psychology. And I won't read this whole quote to save time, but, Dewey has a very nice account of this sort of way in which moral deliberation and the self is comprised of imaginative rehearsals of the responses we get from others, from our peers, particularly those in our communities whose opinions we value. Our thoughts are saturated with the ideas that others entertain about them. So this is, of course, a deposit, a Jamesian deposit in Dewey. All right, so I'm going to do this real quick, and maybe we can follow up on this in discussion, because I'm mindful we got other people that need to have some time. But given this social relational account of the self, what does pragmatism say about moral philosophy's purpose? Well, I've already thrown this out. It says we need to abandon the quest for grounding assumptions that try to answer a skeptic who assumes an asocial self. And the belief in such grounding assumptions is, in fact, an idle fifth wheel, a difference that makes no difference, right? So I kind of think this move, this fifth wheel argument move, is something you see in James Dewey and in fact in Richard Rorty. I do think probably in the long run, there is a difference that makes a difference between normative grounders and pragmatists. I think pragmatists like James and Dewey would say abandoning these grounding assumption moves creates a more tolerant and open and a flexible way of engaging moral life. But there it is. And so normative grounding here, I mean to be something very, very broad, not just some sort of like Platonic, sort of Platonic realism, but even, Kantian constructivisms, any account that thinks our practices require some sort of grounding outside of them. So in a real quick way, here, this is the notions I'm playing with, fifth wheel arguments. These are arguments that pragmatists use to cast doubt on this kind of pattern of thinking. They're casting doubt on the fact that some assumption, it could be any number of moral grounding assumptions, is required to make sense of our engagement with valuable social practices or personal dispositions. So the argument that they're attacking takes, this rough form that, you'd only have this practice only can be made sense of on the assumption of some grounding claim. And pragmatists are trying to say, look, we can get quite by without the grounding claim. We can make reasonable explanations of a practice's success and our dedication and love of it without the grounding claim. So I think pragmatists aren't saying that they can demonstrate the grounding claim is false, but rather want to cast reasonable doubt on it and show it is idle. And I think Rorty's great on this with an essay on Searle, of all people, when he uses the example of oath swearing to make a kind of point about, sort of grounding claims. He says, look, long after people gave up theological beliefs, the practice of oath swearing still retains its value and serious engagement, even though, you might have all manner of atheists, agnostics, and theists engaging in that practice. So knowing that I'm at my 12-minute mark, I just, if you want to see it, I can show you, send you the PowerPoint later, but I try to work out, Rorty's version of the fifth wheel argument. He does this in his essay, Human Rights, Rationality, and Sentimentality. Chris Voparil can tell us about that in maybe better detail than I could, but Rorty basically wants to say we can make sense of the progress of human rights culture by simply relying on sympathy, sentimental stories, not traditional kinds of grounding moves. And in Dewey, since this is about HNC, I see this in a number of places in HNC. Here at the end of the book on page 223, Dewey is like, facing this imagined objector who says, how can it just be social practices and customs all the way down? Where is the authority of right? And I tried to highlight in this long quote, Dewey saying, look, if a man lived alone in the world, we might take seriously the why be moral question, but we are socially embedded from the get-go. And so this is sort of a moot challenge. You could also see page 57 of HNC for that. And James's fifth wheel argument occurs in Moral Philosophy and Moral Life when he responds to an imagined worry about what authority do the demands of others have on us. So I know I'm even over time, Len, but I did my best, and I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen so that others can chime in. I hope that made sense and wasn't too quickly rambly, but there's what I have to offer.
Yeah, it was very great. It actually saves me half the time of my own presentation. But Marilyn, you are up next.
All right. Let me find how to share my screen. Okay.
There you go.
Almost there. Slideshow. Okay. Thank you, Todd. That was wonderful how much you packed in, and I can't wait to read your book. And many thanks to Len and to Kyle for putting this together. I'm planning on learning a lot from everyone. All right, Len asked me to talk about Jane Addams' ethics. Now, this will not be the typical presentation of Addams' ethics. Most of the typical presentations of her ethics focus on her first book, Democracy and Social Ethics, published in 1902. It is a lovely book, but it doesn't deal with what I think is a much neglected question in Adams' theorizing, and that is, what time is it? And why is this not? There we
There
go.
you go.
We're talking about Human Nature and Conduct, published in 1922. Adams also published a book in 1922, Peace and Bread in Time of War. And the distance between 1902 and 1922 is almost incalculable. The best, most succinct expression of this comes from historian Barbara Tuchman. The Great War of 1914 to 18 lies like a band of scorched earth, dividing that time from ours. These two books by Adams were written on opposite sides of that scorched earth. Now, the basic pattern of Adams' thinking overall throughout her lifetime, she worked from an evolutionary model of thinking, as did Dewey, as did James, as did a vast number of intellectuals during this time period. Now, if we can talk about organisms in a habitat having an aim, and intellectuals at the time did, it would be aiming for a healthy equilibrium between organisms and habitat. Now, this is particularly tricky for humans because Homo sapiens, like horses and like wolves, are gregarious animals. That was the lingo of the time. And in order to survive, they must herd together. The mechanism for this, generally explained, this is in Darwin, it's in Herbert Spencer, it's in James' Principles. The mechanism for this is the development of sympathetic and social instincts. Yes, they talked about sympathy as a fundamental instinct of gregarious animals in order to survive. And so when Adams writes about sympathy, what's in her mind is, yes, feelings of affection people have for each other, but something much more primordial than that, a basic drive for survival. Now, if you are an evolutionary thinker, you need to redefine basic concepts, ethical and political concepts. And so Adams, when she talks about freedom or liberty, like Dewey, is talking about the ability of individuals and society to flourish within the habitat. Adams defines equality in quite a biological way as based on the great levelers that she names: birth, growth, nutrition, reproduction, and death. Now, I've highlighted nutrition because that is the fulcrum. Without nutrition, the link between birth and death is very, very short. Without nutrition, there is no growth, there is no reproduction. So tuck that in the back of your head for a few minutes. And so in general, when Adams is doing ethics, she engages every aspect of human life, from instincts to emotions to intellect. What needs to be adjusted to achieve this healthy equilibrium in the habitat: basic moral perceptions, daily habits, and structures of social institutions. But the essential question is also, what time is it in the habitat? And by that she means, what is the emerging configuration of the habitat to which we must attend so that our ethics can stay coordinated with the state of the habitat? Now, in Democracy and Social Ethics, the emerging trends were toward urbanization and industrialization. And so that book looks at what are the appropriate ethics for the city rather than the rural environment. Her next book, Newer Ideals of Peace, the dominant emerging trends to which she attends are the fact that the US was becoming thoroughly embedded in the global economy, and that the United States was joining the race for empire with the Spanish-American War. And so in Newer Ideals of Peace, she no longer talks about individual ethics and social ethics. Instead, the aim she defines as an internationalized humanitarianism. By the time we get to 1922, the challenge is how to heal the scorched earth. Now, Adams herself was an internationalist from about 1900 on in her basic perceptions of the world and in her way of processing what needs to be done. Hull House itself was located in an immigrant neighborhood with dozens of nationalities who had come recently from the hinterlands of Southern and Eastern Europe, parts of Russia, and as well parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so how all of those folks densely packed together in this one ward of Chicago could learn to get along was itself an international challenge. One historian described Hull House as an international hostelry because international visitors streamed through Hull House continuously. Adams was interacting with them. Also, she went to Europe on a number of occasions before the war and also during the war. And she knew social reformers from throughout Europe. She knew political figures and leading intellectuals, and their perspectives had become hers. Now, what was World War I? It was a new kind of war, best described as industrialized slaughter. One result of the war was that 4 great empires, the Russian Empire, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman Empire, all collapsed, carving out many new countries, rendering millions of people homeless and stateless. It's hard for us as Americans to understand the devastation of the war. The war lasted over 4 years. The amount of time that the US had a sizable number of fighting forces in World War I was about 8 months. And you can see the difference here. And you can see why Europeans had a different understanding of the war, a different experience of the war. Both sides use the same imagery. There's a US poster and a German poster presenting the other side as a dehumanized beast. They use the same kind of imagery to present themselves as victimized, the suffering woman holding the dead or near dead child. So there was a lot of scorches that needed to be healed. When you asked intellectuals at the beginning of the war on both sides of the Atlantic, what happened? They could list geopolitical reasons, but the reason that they understood as the deepest ones was that the pugnacious instincts had overwhelmed the sympathetic ones, and it is the actions of the sympathetic instincts as they grow and change that creates civilization. So Bertrand Russell says, a whole population hitherto peaceable and humane precipitated in a few days down the steep slope to primitive barbarism. Adams talked several times about falling down the ladder of civilization, so that at the end of the war, the task was to begin recreating civilization over again from near the crude beginnings of human progress. And so what Adams did throughout the years of the war and many years thereafter was to focus on food. Remember what food is. It is the fulcrum, nutrition, the fulcrum of the ability to lead a life at all. And so during the war, she went around the country and spoke mostly to women's groups. She was asked by Herbert Hoover. Now, those of you who know Hoover as the president who sleepwalked through the Great Depression need to wind back your knowledge of him a little bit. He was the person who during 4 years of the war and years afterward used his organizational skills, his logistics, his distribution to quite literally keep millions of people alive throughout Europe who otherwise would have died. He did it by calling on American women to change the way they ate. And I think this is a wonderful quotation from Adams. She was reflecting on her speeches to women's groups because it pulls together the foundations of her ethical thinking. A great world purpose, in this case, keeping millions of people alive, could not be achieved without women's participation. And Hoover knew there were few restaurants at the time. When people ate, they ate because women prepared the food. Founded upon an intelligent understanding, there's the intellect. And so Adams would talk about quite precisely where the needs were in Europe. And she would be quite precise about why you should cook corn muffins for dinner rather than wheat muffins so the wheat could be shipped, and on and on and on. Achieving this recalled for the widest sympathy, and that's what she was trying to do. engage the sympathetic instincts of the American women so they would develop ties of sympathetic connection to people that they would never meet. At the same time, the demand could only be met if attached to her domestic routine. There are habits, daily habits, that we need to inculcate all of this and pull it together into our daily activities. Adams was among the first Americans to enter the lands of the Central Powers at the end of the war. And this is what she saw. The devastation, the starvation, the malnutrition was just widespread all over the countries of the Central Powers. The picture at the bottom hit me anew when I came across it, because now we know where Kherson, Ukraine is. And what they're experiencing now is the third time within the past 100 years that they have been hit with this scale of catastrophe. It's a hunger map of Europe, and notice the black band of nations that were under conditions of absolute famine. And every country in Europe had serious deficiencies in their food supplies. The need was great at 1918 at the end of the war. And so Adams again worked with Herbert Hoover to raise funds to take food to where it was needed. Adams mostly went to German American groups and encouraged them to funnel their money through the German Red Cross. She knew the people in the German Red Cross. She had visited feeding centers, she had visited schools, orphanages, and saw where the need was and how the people were responding. Now, the war destroyed roads, transportation lines, agricultural areas, and so you would get food to people who needed it any way you could. And again, Adams was in the middle of all of this. Adams' hope for the League of Nations follows the very same pattern that she had used with the American women during the war. If only the League of Nations, she said, could begin by dealing with the starving children on both sides of the war, figure out how do you feed them? And then these people who had been fighting each other in the war might learn how to care about the same thing, might learn how to have sympathy for each other, might develop the skills of interaction with each other, daily habits, so that they then could turn to dealing with international problems. There was a newspaper reporter from Cincinnati once who was castigating Adams for raising funds to help those Bolsheviks. This was right after the Bolshevik Revolution. Adams retorted, "You can be as savagely anti-Bolshevik as you please, but you can't be or shouldn't be anti-human. Save the lives of those suffering people now and think about their political and economic beliefs later." One of the most striking statements in Adams' writings comes at the very end of Peace and Bread in Time of War. She's quoting from H.G. Wells. "But I know that I firmly believe so much in this great world at peace that lies so close to our own. I must needs go about this present world of disorder and darkness like an exile, doing such feeble things as I can toward the world of my desire, now hopefully, now bitterly, as the mood may happen before I die." For you see, by the end of the war, the most pressing problem was not only how to feed the hungry, was also how to continue to live and to continue to deal with these problems at a time when the world itself was still so close to immediate catastrophe, when despair and grief and hopelessness were all around. I think the fact that Adams kept going and continued to work was a matter of sheer toughness and her sheer refusal to give in to the blackness that enveloped much of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. What a wonderful talk. I got something funny up here, and I don't know what this is. I might have to. Okay, very good. Uh, you know, Todd's talk and Marilyn's really bring home that pragmatist ethics does not deal with trivialities and metaphysical conundrums. Why be moral? Should I keep a promise? It deals with the pressing issues that a live creature finds him or herself in a world that's beset with problems and disturbances, and starts with all the equipment that a person in such a world has. So they're both wonderful introductions to my talk. Nope, unfortunately, wait a second, here it is. Good. Can you see that? Can somebody tell me whether this is seeable?
We
Yes.
got it, Len. I see it.
Okay, very, very good. So my talk is basically trying to bring human nature and conduct into this conversation. I have to figure out how to do this. How do I move these forward? I don't know.
Down on the bottom left,
Down on the bottom.
if you bring your cursor over to the bottom left, does it give you arrows?
Here we go.
There you go.
Okay, this seems to do the job. Very, very good. So part one is about social psychology. Human nature and conduct is subtitled Introduction to Social Psychology, although Dewey says that he's not really talking about being a survey of social psychology, but rather bringing the social into psychology as a way of regrounding ethics on sound psychological principles. And the three psychological notions that he deals with are impulse, habit, and intelligence. Todd has already made clear that Dewey borrows extensively from James in his discussion of both impulse and habit. And so there's a great continuity of pragmatist ethics there. And we also see the notion of habit playing a large role then in Adams. So to put this a little bit more solidly, impulses are malleable. They are always constant, but they're malleable and have to be expressed in action through social institutions, including ordinary customary morality. And because impulses are malleable, but social customs are and institutions are more settled, repeated action in a social situation forms habits. And habits then are able to express our impulses until they meet with disturbances, imbalances, and then we get the hesitation of doubt. And it is then that consciousness arises and intelligence comes into focus. So I'm going to have this in here. Let me see if I can get this. Okay, so impulse is constant. The nervous system is always at work, even when we're sleeping. There are always motor neurons firing. There's no need to explain action in general because the live creature is always engaged, always, even when sleeping. There are motor neurons moving. Impulse is always being expressed. So the individual finds themselves in a situation, habit directs themselves to an end in view. And let me give it just an example. Finish with work, you get in the car and you drive home. Go to the same car, you take the same road, you drive to the same address, and you do it at the same time. All of our life is filled with actions of just this sort. Habit forms as impulse enters into social situations, which are reasonably stable, so we act in the same way over and over again. Others already have established ways of doing things, and when we're born, we are introduced into a society that does all kinds of things in pretty settled ways. But habits are not rigid and mechanical. They have to be adjusted to changing conditions. We form habits of doing, like driving home for dinner. but we also form habits of thinking about doing, habits of critical awareness and deliberation, so that when habit runs into obstacles and we are led to think, we already have also routines of thinking, but they themselves can run into obstacles. So when we are moving along in a habitual manner and we can run into a brick wall, there are conflicting rules. So one, the murderer shows up at the house and with a gun and says, "Where's your father?" Well, there's a rule not to lie, but there's also a rule to protect your loved ones. So you have to stop and think. Or our impulses conflict with our moral conventions. You really love that girl next door, but you're already married. So like this causes you to stop and hesitate. A good thing, actually, and think. So intelligence now enters the scene. And for Dewey, intelligence takes the form of deliberation or dramatic rehearsal. So what is dramatic rehearsal? Dramatic rehearsal is not calculation. And Dewey makes a large point of disagreeing with utilitarian thinking on this score. You might think, well, what do I do? Should I, suppose you find yourself with a month of free time and you don't know really what to do and you can't do your habitual thing of going to work. So, should I go to the beach? That seems nice. Or maybe I'll go to the mountains. The air is fresh up there. Or maybe I'll study for a new qualification. So deliberation takes the form of an imaginative, qualitative exploration of possibilities. You have to think yourself into what it'll be like at the beach. Is the weather going to be okay? What is it like at this time of the year? The mountains, is it going to be too cold? Etc. Maybe studying for a new qualification. But deliberation is open-ended and radical. It is not limited to the first possibilities that show up. That is, a person could say, you know what, beach, mountains, nah, not that interesting, waste of time. And as for studying for a qualification, maybe I don't want to study for this qualification. I'm meeting resistance because this profession is no longer right for me. Maybe I should think about an entirely different thing to do. Or perhaps maybe I should even start a union in my work to work against the intolerable conditions. And Dewey was always doing that, which is interesting. Black people are humiliated. Well, somebody could write a letter to the editors. Dewey cooperates with others in forming the NAACP. Professors, educated teachers are not being educated soundly. Dewey joins with others and forms the Society for Professors of Education. Some colleagues are being closed down at work. He works with others to form the university, associate university professors. So deliberation is seeking the best resolution for that person in that situation at that time, something that's going to really liberate their energies, as the beach or the mountains just don't really do in this case. So here is the cycle. Start with impulse. Impulses are channeled through conventions. You form habits. Habits run into obstacles. There's intelligent deliberation. The deliberate action is then taken and the consequences are experienced, learning and reconstruction of impulses and habits. And this is a non-stop cycle through life. And that brings us to ethics and morality, because we're trying to find the best resolution. So here I want to talk about what is the good person, what is right action, and what is the human good. So in deliberation, the choice is not merely what act to perform, but what sort of person are you becoming? Well, you could study for a qualification, but maybe you think, well, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to become a different kind of person. I want to have a different career, or I want to help my coworkers. I want to form a union. The more important moral question is not, well, what shall I do? But what shall I be? What kind of person is right for me to become? Now, character is the sum of all of our coordinated habits, and it is always in action. It is all of our impulses as they are channeling themselves into particular situations. Character is the structure of the person. We are our character, and a morally good person is a person with good character. What is that? Good person is a person with growth character. They are always thinking, what is something new and challenging? What can I do that's a little bit more than the habitual, the ordinary? What can I do? And when I run into obstacles, what can I make of those that is going to really challenge me? So the person who has the growth character, the person's always expanding themselves, always thinking anew and fresh. And then what is the good? Here's a quote: "The good consists in the meaning that is to be experienced to belong to an activity when conflict and entanglement of various incompatible impulses and habits terminate in a unified, orderly release and action." So you're moving along, you run into some obstacle, you stop and think, and you rehearse different possibilities, and you think about them deeply until new action is released. And here you go, you're really moving in a new direction. You're forming that union, or you are preparing that organization, or you're doing something new, fresh, and challenging. That's the good. The good is that experience of release, of reorganization, growth, and release. Dewey says, in quality, the good is never twice alike. It never copies itself. It is new every morning and fresh every evening. It is unique in every presentation, for it marks the resolution of a distinctive complication of competing habits and impulses, which can never repeat itself. So the good is good now, it's good now, it's good now, but there's no adding them up. You can't say, well, a good life is, I had, 3 points here and 6 points there. It's like right now. The good is always in the present, not in the remote future. The good lies right here, not in getting or attaining some future end. The end only helps us organize the possibilities for reconsideration and release in the present. When we get to the future, as Dewey says, it's just another present with its own complications and problems and worries. You can't keep putting it off forever. Good cannot be, you can't just say, well, this is just instrumental. All this struggle and pain is just instrumental to my getting a promotion. If the promotion does not help you really organize things in a vital way right now, then you're on the wrong track. And finally, the only moral criterion is growth. Our choices affect our habits and shape our lives. Who we marry, what career we choose, where we choose to live, shape our entire life. And good choices are those which conduce to our growth and the growth of other people. Good people develop habits of care. Care is concern for the growth of others. As Todd pointed out, there's nothing unusual about that. We are taught to care, right from the crib. But we get better by thinking more deeply about the good and the growth of others. Good people seek opportunities for growth. That is, they seek opportunities for expansion through learning. So Dewey concludes, morals is education. And that's it. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Chris.
Okay, thank you, Len. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I'm grateful to Len and to Kyle, the Dewey Society, for organizing the event, for the invitation. I mean, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here for sure. Unfortunately, I do not have a PowerPoint. I remarked before we started here, Len sent the participants an email that I interpreted to inspire us to, quote, speak from the heart rather than use a PowerPoint, but it seems Len didn't inspire himself there. So I apologize for that. I realize when it's too late that speaking from the heart doesn't quite work, but so I'll try to be concise and heartfelt, perhaps. So like others, I've really valued this opportunity to revisit human nature and conduct because I realized, I typically would go back to it just to draw from particular parts, and the idea of character is the interpenetration of habits, and the notion of morality is social. And I really, it was a challenge to think about how the book coheres as a whole, because as we've already established, there's a lot going on here. I mean, it's entitled, subtitled An Intro to Social Psychology, but as Murphy explains in the intro to the Middle Works volume, it builds out of Dewey's earlier concerns with individual psychology, with education, with inquiry, and with morality, and then seeks to extend these further into the realm of social psychology and social reform. So that's a lot already. Individual psychology, inquiry, morality, social psychology, social reform, and then concludes in the next sentence, it also is a, quote, powerful justification of democracy. And to add to that, Len has written elsewhere that Human Nature and Conduct is, quote, Dewey's most comprehensive ethical treatise. So in thinking about how to get a handle on all of that, I decided to focus on sort of two dimensions that I think are significant. One is the conception of moral or ethical normativity that I think Dewey puts forth here. And perhaps this intersects with the last part of Todd's talk. And then the second thing is to think about, the means that Dewey's offering for bringing about this conception and this alternative understanding of normativity. I mean, I think certainly it's a relational conception of ethics, right? We've already heard social relational, but perhaps it's even more to the extent that Dewey emphasizes, quote, our interaction with the physical environment. The introduction, emphasizes this continuity between nature, man, and society. And, quote, all conduct is the interaction between the elements of human nature and the environment, natural and social. So clearly, right, human conduct is regulated by both nature and social experience. And I couldn't help but think of Adams' Democracy and Social Ethics throughout. Of course, Dewey doesn't cite Adams here that I'm aware of, but I think we know from some of Charlene Haddock-Sightfried's work that often he didn't cite Adams as promptly as he should. Often it would come many years later. So I'm interested in the influence, perhaps, of Adams' book here. But the other way I thought about it, and I'm not sure if this helps anyone else, and I promise not to spend much time on Rorty, but Rorty's idea of the priority of democracy to philosophy is a way of approaching this. In other words, in Rorty's words, and I think this is slightly overstated, but he calls it an approach to philosophy that is, quote, putting politics first and then tailoring a philosophy to suit. Now, this, I think, isn't so much a kind of instrumental approach on the most generous understanding, but simply that, Dewey is philosophizing from within, right? The context of democratic life, culture, social environment, and attempting to work out conceptions of morality and ethics that are, at home and influenced by his experience in democracy, as opposed to seeking some sort of external neutral standpoint from which to give this account. And I find it's helpful for thinking about the way in which the melioristic emphasis plays out, not just in, quote, social reform, but the way that the concepts and the notion of normativity already come kind of grounded within democratic context. So what this means, maybe a little more formally in terms of normativity, and this is mostly drawing from the last chapter, if you could see the quotes I'm looking at, which are not in a PowerPoint, sorry again. He says, quote, morals is as much a matter of interaction of a person with his social environment as walking is an interaction of legs with a physical environment. And he makes clear that in saying that all morality is social, he's not making the claim that morals ought to be social. I think this is really clear, because he says introducing the moral ought, this is page 219 in the Middle Works volume, he writes, suggests, quote, that morals depend upon something apart from social relations. For Dewey, of course, he writes, morals are social. The question of ought, he continues, or should be, is a question of better and worse in social affairs. And to my mind, I think this is, key to what Todd was talking about in terms of the argument against the kind of normative grounding. I think it's a place where Dewey, Rorty, and Joseph Margolis all align in the idea, I mean, this is Rorty, but I think it could be Dewey, the quote, we have no access to a source of normativity other than the practices of the people around us. And this becomes sort of the primary dividing line between what's sometimes called the Pittsburgh School of Pragmatism, that would include like a Robert Brandom and a John McDowell, versus a Deweyan Darwinian approach that is going to stay within what we can account for empirically when we talk about morality. If I actually, as it happens, did a presentation on Margolis and normativity yesterday, and just to give one sentence on it, his way of us understanding normativity that is, I think, deeply Deweyan, this is Margolis, is that a kind of Sittlich normativity, drawing on, the Hegelian notion that normativity is grounded in the customs, traditions, habits, etc., collective intentions of a community, and there's really nothing outside that.
Mhm.
There's no deep semantic base, and there's no sort of independent epistemic or metaphysical base. And I think that's key, because it makes us understand how pre-normative and pre-inferential facts are part of learning how to be normative, that we learn how to be normative. Even on Brandam's most rationalist account, we learn how to use discourse correctly. It's not, and because of the learning, because of the transition from, as Margolis puts it, kind of the mongrel language of animals through human beings, human infants to mature persons, that learning is going to have to involve pre-normative and pre-inferential qualitative backgrounds. Okay. So I think that's the case. That's the conception of normativity. It's thoroughly Sittlich. Now, how does Dewey want to bring this about? And this is the part that I think gave me pause, and maybe it even gave Rorty pause, but I sort of started to rethink it on this rereading, is that he turns to, quote, the methods and materials of a science of human nature. He writes about, quote, the science of man, and in this very book as presenting, quote, a scientific social psychology. And I think that's, as we know, Dewey often used terms, vocabularies in new and different ways than conventionally used, and it's very vulnerable to understanding there. As I dug back into it this time, I started to realize that what he's trying to do, and others may already know this, but it was important for me to see it, in turning to this, quote, science of human nature, what he's really trying to do is provide an alternative to a traditional understanding of moral ought that he says is simply a matter of, quote, blame and approbation. That is more emotional than intellectual, and that is, quote, guided by custom, personal convenience, and resentment rather than by insight into causes and consequences. So the problem, he thought, on this traditional view of simple moral judgment based on blame and praise is that it reduces moral instruction to, quote, an adjustment of personal likes and dislikes. And it leads to fault finding in others when we judge them morally. And that creates resentment in the one blamed. And in the quote, moral person doing the judging, a kind of defensive attitude that he writes is, quote, apologetic and self-exculpating. So the alternative to these emotional rather than intellectual kinds of moral judgments, he writes, is, quote, a habit of scrutinizing conduct objectively, and, quote, an impartial habit of observation. So I think the appeal that is explicitly to a science of human nature and a scientific social psychology, I think, is perhaps much broader than that. Maybe, a German sense of kind of human sciences that is going to be inclusive of humanistic, I think, forms of understanding, and not sort of scientific method in some sort of really technical sense. And that the importance of that is that it allows us to get outside of conventional, I think, forms of moral normativity that rely on simple praise and blame. And this, of course, becomes a task for education, but I think even there, that's too narrow to the extent that he wants to transform and make more intelligent, not just sort of formal educational settings, which is certainly part of it, but the entire, quote, interaction between the elements of human nature, environment, natural and social that we started with. And that this sort of scientific approach, I think, gives him a way to do all that. Okay, thank you. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Chris. We are now open for comments and questions.
Lynn, what time are we wrapping up this section to take our
This,
bathroom
we
break?
have, as I see it, 18 minutes.
Great. There's so many places where these presentations come together. So who wants to take a stab at kind of talking about that, or asking a question that might allow us to see these congruences?
I can't help but just, if I can just barge in, like on Chris's last point, Chris, I think you are spotting like a really important theme that Dewey harps on about the dangers of judgments of praise and blame. The practice of judgment itself has consequences that can get out of hand and cause havoc unwittingly. So I'm glad you brought that up. I wonder if, what people think, like, is there a connection between that kind of practice, over-reliance on simple judgments of praise and blame, and a philosophical, like, obsession with normative grounding or, absolutist ethics? I think Dewey does try to draw those connections. So I just want to toss that out there. I don't really know that I have a well-formulated question, but Chris or anybody want to take that up just for starts?
Yeah, I'd rather hear what others think.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just want to toss that out as a theme. Yeah, anyway, sure.
Good theme, though.
It's greater.
I was thinking myself about the passage in Human Nature and Conduct. I don't remember where it is, where he says, look, nobody's so stupid as to think that you can live in the past.
It becomes greater.
We do get, we do get feedback from those with whom we are interacting, and it's their feedback that helps us to understand the value of what we've done. But the purpose is always for Dewey prospective, not retrospective. And I think, Todd, that's what you're sort of focusing on and what Chris has caused us to think about. Anybody want to pick up on that?
If I may, I'll just throw in, he actually talks about, people's responses to us in two different ways. So there's the way that he criticizes as being, problematic, as Todd, you were just mentioning, where it's very much personal. But if you look at the passages where he's talking about, I keep hearing some odd whispering sort of in the background. Does anyone else hear this?
Yeah.
Somebody's mic must be on. They're having to try to talk to someone. But there's also the passages in the section where he's talking about moral deliberation as dramatic rehearsal, where he also goes on to talk about how, we learning from the responses others have to us, we develop a public forum internally that we then use to judge our actions. So their praise and blame matter, and they can matter in a good sense and a bad sense. That it's problematic when it's too idiosyncratic and personal, but when it's somehow generalized and looking at observable consequences we can all sort of publicly discuss, seems to be, the way he thinks is the most reliable way to turn it into a sort of public forum in which idiosyncrasies somewhat cancel themselves out. And that, I think, links up with what you were talking about, Chris, where we're looking to some kind of empirical method, or at least partially empirical method, that's going to help us do that. And that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I can jump into the piece that I wrote had a lot to do with the section on impulses. And in that section, it spends a lot of time talking about young people, children, and the development of character has a lot to do with approbation and disapprobation. And so I think the point that I'm reading and that I'm hearing is that it's not that all morality reduces to that simple sort of thing. That it could be part of it, and it could be part of moving from some negative impulse to some habit, but that's not the only thing that morality is about.
Well, I remember Patrick Noel Smith. I don't know if I'm so old that nobody else remembers him, but in his book, praise and blame become like tools of influence, right? And Dewey says exactly the same thing 20 years earlier, that praise and blame are part of the apparatus of the moral life. We make moral judgments to affect people, and we can affect them for good or for ill. And of course, our moral judgments can go off the rail in all sorts of ways. Because I think this is very pertinent to the current discussion about wokeness. We live in a world which is absolutely flush with moral judgment. And Dewey says, not in human nature and conduct, but in the ethics, I think he says that one of the most difficult moral questions is when to raise a moral question. And what he means there is that moral judgments of praise and blame have consequences, and sometimes they don't have the consequences that we want. So we have to evaluate them empirically to get some sense of whether they're doing the job that we want them to do.
So there are really two kinds of things happening here. And I think a number of you have alluded to this, and I just want to sort of highlight the concreteness of the Jane Addams perspective here that I think is so compelling and so important for us to keep in mind. But there are two kinds of things going on. One is, at what point, what is the judgment, moral judgment about? Is the judgment about your action, or is it about my action? How does judgment, a pragmatist judgment, serve us? And it can really be problematic, sometimes useful, but often dangerous when we are focusing on the actions of others, rather than, again, taking this prospective point of view about how do I think you mentioned ethics as growth, I don't want to say growth mindset because of what that means today, but the importance of growth. We're moving towards growth prospectively, not judgment, blame, and punishment retrospectively.
Well, I think Lee was referring a little bit to this when we were thinking about judgments that are imposed upon young people. You might want to say a little bit more about that.
I mean, so I didn't write directly on it, but I mean, the idea seems to be that young folks are impulsive, as just that's the way people are as being young, and that we can manipulate them. We do manipulate them by praising certain types of behaviors and you know, giving them a look when they do something we don't like. And the story goes, at least in the passage I'm referring to, that what he ends up, the agent at some point can take this on themselves and can self-regulate and can start to decide for themselves how to play out this impulse into a different habit, or how does the habit look? What types of things do I intelligently decide to do? And he said something like, whether or not someone's watching or not, we do these sorts of things, as if there is someone who is there or not, but as if there's someone watching. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. You know, I'm trying to find, as we're talking, there's these nice passages, and I can't remember for the life of me where Dewey talks about praise and blame in terms of, you know, criminals. So like simple knee-jerk reactions to criminals. And he says something to the effect of just relying on sort of these knee-jerk, blame the criminal, throw him away in jail, you know, sort of exonerates us from responsibility. So it's about fostering a sense of a proper moral judgment is not avoiding praise and blame, but about locating responsibility in a productive, forward-looking way. And I'm, you know, going crazy here looking through my HNC book, because that passage I had highlighted and jumped out at me, but maybe Len, you know where it is, or some of you other HNC experts, but I think it's along these same lines of, you know, the good forward-looking approach to judgments of praise and blame.
Well, while Len is looking that up, I want to go back, Todd, to how you formulated your question to begin with about, is there a connection between ethics that are constructed on normative foundations and this simplistic praise blame game? And I think there is, because it sets up, like it does for legal questions, state the rule, deduce the consequences. While the thinkers we're looking at are all inheritors of Darwin, and to think in terms of organisms in the environment, which introduces enormous complications from the very beginning. And so you need some method other than calculation, as Len was talking about, the dramatic rehearsal. I'll run as many of these things through my mind as I can, use my imagination and carry on, because it's going to be different every single time. And you can't do that if you have a normative foundation theory of ethics.
I can't help think that, you know, what is more impulsive than our current sort of, you know, Twitterverse and sort of, you know, knee-jerk response to things. And perhaps it's almost, I don't know if I'm interpreting, Lee, what you're saying about that it's almost a kind of developmental psychology perspective emerging, where sure, all morality starts that way, with just bad, good, praise, blame, put the cookie back or whatever. But the dramatic rehearsal seems to be sort of a higher stage, and perhaps something that might help today with social media and the impulsiveness that drives it. Maybe we've regressed socially,
Yeah.
the immature state.
I think it does say something about those activities that we see as appropriate when we get upset, or when something hits us as wrong. some people immediately think I'm going to tweet about this, or I'm just going to lash out online, right? And that's not hardwired into us, right? Somebody learned that sort of thing. That's in the culture now, right? And so part of what I'm reading is that we could change this. We don't have to respond this way. These impulses aren't somehow necessary.
Right, we don't have to respond in those ways. And there are larger things we might do if we were John Dewey. We might actually, start thinking about organizations. And I mean, Dewey has this just immense ability to go from a specific, Jane Addams is a great case in point, right? I mean, going from a phenomenon of hunger to thinking about this on the world scale. And it's an invitation to us too. It's an invitation not only to us as professors, because we are positioned to do things like this. We have a platform, but it's available to people who are positioned in different ways to take a larger perspective.
I found my passage. It's on page 17. It's really early. So, but Len, there he's really great in talking about the moral question is always future oriented. He talks about this fictional belief in sort of simplistic metaphysical free will is exonerating us of our duty to figure out how to handle complex problems like crime and how to deal with those sort of situations. So I'm tempted to read the passages out loud, but I won't. But if you have your HNC handy, it's on pages 17 and 18. It's right at the beginning where he is very clear about the importance of locating responsibility and consequences and future oriented judgment. Anyway.
Good. Well, let's have last comments and questions and take a 5-minute break.
I have something that probably will take more time than we want to, but let me just lay it out. One of the problems that I have when teaching and writing about HNC is addressing those who don't believe that these impulses we're talking about, that human nature is an opportunity, but sort of have this view deep in their hearts that human nature is depraved. And as a result, we cannot let go of a more fixed normativity. Do any of you have, Todd, you alluded to this, there were a couple of other references in that direction, but how do you respond to that? How do you talk about this view of ethics in the face of people who are saying, yes, but there is ethical truth, I know what it is, and by the way, we need it, and why we need it is this depravity in human nature.
So I can say that part of my talk is going to address some of this stuff, particularly the idea that some people try to justify hierarchies and economic disparities with the idea that human beings are just greedy creatures, that's hardwired into our human nature. We're always after zero-sum games or something. And so Dewey takes that up and he actually addresses it and he tries to change human nature. And so that was the one thing that I'm going to really try and talk about because it always seemed weird to me. But I'm going to talk more about that in my talk. So.
Well, that's good.
Barb, I'll just respond with a brief little anecdote that somewhat relates to the issue you're raising. I do get a few of those students in my classes from time to time to kind of adhere to that depravity view you're talking about. And one of the more interesting moments where this unfolded was about a year ago. I had in a doctoral ethics course, a student from China who stayed after class within the first couple of weeks and told me how difficult of a time she was having taking this course alongside Americans with this deep individualist kind of perspective. And Some of them, one in particular, was very outspoken about this kind of moral depravity kind of view. And she actually ended up dropping the course. Like, she just could not stomach this encounter with this kind of American view. And so as you were sharing that I had her in mind in that moment of seeing her leave the class in my mind.
Well, I'll look forward to hearing from Lee.
Yeah, this is Chris. One other way, or maybe even two ways to respond to the, the kind of moral truth insistence. One is like what Margolis does, is just point to empirical facts, what he calls the huge archival history of competing visions and options of how humankind should live and has actually lived. And that, the idea that we can define any one or even several that have been preponderant at a particular time that would be accepted by the entire species is just, in a rational or timeless way, is just silliness. So there's going to be diversity and pluralism. But then the other way is from the perspective of the community and communal norms being sort of prior to epistemic norms. In other words, the only reason why truth has an epistemic constraint on us is when there's already some layer of intersubjective agreement already there, like as an interpretive community. And some of that is pre-discursive, some of it is discursive. But if once that breaks down, right, it's perhaps we are today, where you have fragmentation of interpretive communities. It's been said that, appealing to truth doesn't get us anywhere when people around you believe in lies, right? So I think the appeal to that single truth you can sort of undermine it in different ways, but they're sort of empirical first. And then secondly, on this account of normativity, it's always rooted in a community and its practices first. And that's the only reason why certain communities think they have the truth. It's not because it's special access to reality,
Thanks, Chris. And Sarah.
No, I think that's a very good place to end the session. Barbara, can we take 5 minutes in case people need to run off to the bathroom or whatever, get a cup of tea, and we'll be back.
We'll start at 1:30 promptly.
30, that's good.
1:30 my time, so let's see. I
1:30,
can't even do all
would
the
be fine. That would
calculations.
be 6:30 my. That'd
Half
be
past
excellent.
the hour. Figure out where you are.
Half past the hour, whatever hour that might be.
See everybody very soon.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Arnie, please go around. Hey, Hey, Arnie. I just said that you had a moment. Yeah, it was a bad connection.
Well, then I think it's 1:30. Well, half past the hour.
Yep, well.
Time
I'll-
flies.
I guess I can start by handing the mic over to Andrea, who will share and be timekeeper for the
Yes.
next session. Hi, Andrea.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I want to introduce my panel, which is called Education Growth and Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct. And my esteemed panelists are Professor Jennifer Welchman, whose main areas of research and teaching are in ethics, history of moral philosophy, and environmental ethics. And she's currently working on a book on the ethics of environmental stewardship, for which she received funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Funding Council. And we'll also be hearing from Professor Lee McBride, who is Professor of Philosophy at the College of Worcester. Professor McBride specializes in American philosophy, ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of race. And he's also writing a book, a short monograph on the philosophy of W.E.B. Du Bois, coming out with Indiana University Press. And I hope we can hear more about each of those works from the authors today, potentially. And just in case anyone doesn't know, and I know this is being recorded, so you might have a wider audience than who's here. I'm Andrea English. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education at University of Edinburgh. And my work focuses on Dewey's theory of education, as well as on the German traditions of philosophy of education and 20th century critical pedagogy. So I will now hand it over to Jennifer.
Oops. Thank you very much. So I should warn you, Leonard suggested I talk about how and why HNC became my favorite of Dewey's texts and what I built upon it since. So this is a bit more autobiographical than the other talks so far, and I also don't have PowerPoints. So Human Nature and Conduct is now my favorite of Dewey's many books, but I wasn't particularly drawn to it when I first read it. My introduction to Dewey's philosophy came about accidentally when I was working on a reception study of G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica for a graduate seminar. I discovered a striking disparity in the philosophical responses to Moore's Principia, with relatively little of the enthusiasm shown by British philosophers being shared by their American counterparts. And I discovered that quite a large contingent of North American moral philosophers simply weren't interested in the debates that Moore's book had prompted. These philosophers were taking their lead from some guy called John Dewey. And I became curious. What did they find so compelling about Dewey's approach to ethics that it would be more than a generation before British-style analytic meta-ethical theorizing would become established in North American departments of philosophy? So my first forays into Dewey's work weren't so much driven by my own philosophical interests as by my interest in Dewey's contemporaries. Value theory was all the rage in that period, so I concentrated on the texts in which Dewey discussed those questions at greatest length. And if you asked me what my favorite text was back then, I'd have probably said The Quest for Certainty, with honorable mention going to The Theory of the Moral Life. But having satisfied myself about the interests of Dewey's contemporaries in his output, I felt free to consult my own. And as I was becoming increasingly interested in virtue ethics, I developed a new favorite, which is Human Nature and Conduct, honorable mention now going to Democracy and Education. And this might seem a strange choice if one identifies virtue ethics with Aristotelianism, as regrettably Dewey himself did for so much of his career. Contemporary neo-Aristotelians are neither essentialists nor elitists, as Aristotle was, but many do seem to share his view that the object of the habituation of the young is to develop firm and unyielding virtues in adults. So they will become, in the adults, they will become so firm and unyielding that while they may face death, how else could they display their courage? They will somehow avoid undergoing the incremental decline that tends to accompany older age. Unsurprisingly, the virtues Aristotle identifies as crucial are all dispositions associated with early to middle adulthood, the period when we possess the means and the opportunity to be just and charitable towards others, to be prudent or intemperate in our indulgences, and modest or vainglorious about our accomplishments. He ignores character traits important for the well-being of children, such as playfulness and curiosity, and those important for the well-being of dependent adults, such as gratitude and loyalty. Much of the contemporary virtue ethics literature imitates Aristotle in focusing rather exclusively on our early and very early middle adulthood, though they usually entertain a wider array of social virtues than Aristotle did. However, traits that contribute to the malleability of children's characters still get little attention and are not usually treated as virtues in either sorry, I just lost my place. I'm trying to do this on the computer. In either adult, sorry, not usually treated as virtues in children or adults. Aristotle himself had some excuse for this. Being an existentialist, he naturally concluded that the traits that make our characters malleable in youth are at best propaedeutics to virtue rather than virtues themselves, and that once one has realized one's full potential for virtue, any further character change can only be a degeneration. That dispositions of gratitude and loyalty become especially serviceable when our characters and independence decline was likewise no reason to treat them as virtues. For anyone approaching later middle age, this presents a deeply disturbing picture of our moral futures as a desperate, if doomed, attempt to rigidly maintain our characters as long as possible, no matter what slings and arrows come our way. Now, if I were to label my approach to the virtues, I would have to call it neo-Humean. I would have to, because if I called it neo-Deweyan, no one would know what I meant, least of all Dewey. Yet the moral theory Dewey presents in Human Nature and Conduct is essentially a virtue ethics. That's why it doesn't fit the other categories. It is normatively grounded in a view of character. It is a virtue ethics. Dewey would later describe the text as continuing the tradition of David Hume. But as most people did in the 1920s, Dewey read Hume as a proto-utilitarian. So what Dewey thought he was continuing was a form of pluralistic welfare consequentialism. And later years, in the 1930s, looking back, that's what he described his position as, a sort of socialized utilitarianism. Tellingly, when he refers to Hume's account of the virtues in his 1908 and the 1932 Ethics, it's only to the last section of Book 3 of Hume's treatise, where Hume discusses what he calls our natural virtues, the virtues developed by cultivating natural rather than artificially acquired dispositions. Evidently, Dewey did not consider Hume's artificial virtues to be virtues properly speaking, but rather socially acquired habits whose moral status was a function of their social utility. And of course, he wasn't wrong about that. Hume's artificial virtues are habits socially required in precisely the way Dewey describes. And I have a quote, but I'll skip it. Hume's artificial virtues are Deweyan habits, but unlike Hume's natural virtues, they're not cultivated forms of inborn natural inclinations. So on that ground, they couldn't be Aristotelian virtues or classical virtues at all. And if Dewey had just been able to get over the idea that a virtue ethics has to conform to a classical Aristotelian model to really count as a virtue ethics, he'd have realized there's no reason why Hume's artificially acquired dispositions can't be virtues. Now, for those of us who've already arrived at middle age and are moving well through it, a neo-Humean or Deweyan virtue ethics offers a much more attractive picture of our moral futures. We're not the people we were in early adulthood, but we don't have to conclude that our moral characters are disintegrating. Developing a firm and unyielding character isn't something people do. Our characters exhibit continuity over time, of course, but as Hume would remind us, continuity is not identity. And then here's where Dewey improves upon Hume. For Dewey, it isn't just one set of moral dispositions that socially form through interactions with others, it's all of them. So they all must be amenable to change with our changes in our social circumstances. In my case, the evidence is on display in my closet at home. On the floor are sensible shoes I was once convinced I would never wear. I have them in 3 colors. When I was raising small children, the only hobby I had time for was reading, which didn't require any special gear. But now my son is off flying helicopters. I've taken up kayaking, so I have gear for that up on the top. When I was younger, I didn't have a car, so I didn't need clothes to wear to a gym. Now I've got a shelf full of microfiber t-shirts and leggings because my administrative duties, coupled with reduced public transportation, mean I regularly drive to work. I could go on, but why bother? I'm sure all your own closets tell similar tales, and the important thing is what we make of them. Now, an Aristotelian would say, nothing. Your tastes in shoes or leisure activities have changed, so what? These kinds of changes are no indication of a change in one's character. But from a Deweyan point of view, that's wildly implausible. Changes in patterns of behavior will inevitably alter the relationships between the habits that constitute one's character, if only slightly in each case. But the changes in one's pattern of behavior made by entering a profession, becoming a parent, owning a car, becoming an administrator, can't be called slight. So though I've retained many tastes, interests, and habits from earlier years, I've abandoned others and developed new ones in their place. I've changed, and so has my character, not radically. As Dewey notes, habits that do become settled resist change when circumstances call for it, regrettably, sometimes ensuring continuity over time. But again, continuity is not identity nor inconsistent with change. So we need not view the habits which keep our characters plastic, such as curiosity and playfulness, as threats to our adult characters, at least not when they operate in cooperation with virtues such as prudence, temperance, and justice. And we can welcome the effective traits such as gratitude and loyalty that help us adapt to reductions in our independence that age may bring. Any pragmatic virtue ethicist would endorse all these traits as virtues. And a pragmatic virtue theorist who is a closer follower of Dewey in some ways than I am could also do so for their contribution to our continuing growth. Dewey often identifies growth with living. To cease growth is to begin to die. Here I part company with Dewey somewhat. Now, were he to consistently identify growth with the adaptation of character to changing circumstances, I wouldn't at all. To cease to adapt is plausibly to be on a decline that could certainly end in death. However, Dewey doesn't always just identify growth with successful adaptation. He often characterizes it as an increase in the meaning of our characters or our situations or our conduct. There is, he says, quote, no limit to the amount of meaning which reflective and meditative habit is capable of importing into even simple acts. This, I think, is one of the less benign Hegelian deposits in Dewey's thought, a relic of his earlier perfectionist self-realization ethics. This conception of growth and growing implies that unless our lives are becoming more meaningful now than they were when we were children or teenagers or younger adults or yesterday, our lives have passed their zeniths, and that those whose adaptations to the infirmities of serious old age merely enable them to maintain a cherished way of life successfully are actually failing as moral agents. Only a being with an infinite capacity for self-perfection could avoid this fate. In the passages where Dewey insists on identifying growth with life in this sense, he obscures an important distinction between growth and adaptation. Growth is inherently comparative quantitatively, and adaptation is not. Children don't merely adapt to changing circumstances or renew their interests. They grow. They get bigger. They get stronger. They develop more tastes, not just new ones. Interests, skills, and capacities, more than they started with. And yes, their actions become more meaningful to them in many respects. Adults, by contrast, don't grow. After a certain point, they adapt. They renew their interest, tastes, and skills by exchanging new ones for older ones that no longer have a functional place in their lives. But this doesn't entail that the total set, active at any given time, goes on increasing over time, nor does it entail that the changes in the meanings we assign our actions are actually deeper or greater as opposed to being merely different than at earlier periods. Happily, the Hegelian deposit isn't omnipresent. Running side by side is the less perfectionist, more melioristic conception. When, for example, Dewey writes that, quote, sacrifice may enlarge itself by bringing about a surrender of acquired possessions to requirements of new growth, an exchange of new for old. Dewey was no slave to consistency, so we can take our pick and run with the conception that we think best. And when I think of it, this is actually yet another way in which Dewey continues some of the legacies of Hume. So thank you, and I look forward to any comments you have.
Thank you so much. So I will hand it over to Lee whenever you're ready.
Okay,
It's
can you hear
about
me?
10:45 now, so till the hour approximately, just so you have a sense of where we started. Go
Great.
ahead.
Is the audio good? Can you hear me?
Perfect, yeah.
Great. Okay. So first, let me thank Lynn and Andrea for inviting me. It's an honor to be invited to join in on this. I think I wrote something, and at present it's not fully fleshed out. I think I'm trying to do too much, but it's titled Acquired Impulses, Decoloniality, and Transvaluation Towards a New Human Nature. So the first section, surveying the problem. In the political philosophy of John Dewey, we find a recurring critiques of the United States in the 20th century. In books like Individualism, Old and New, Liberalism and Social Action, and Freedom and Culture, Dewey criticizes laissez-faire liberalism and the American quasi-religious devotion to profit-making. Dewey points out that our society contains alienated, lost individuals who work to survive. He points out that despite our scientific and technological advances, many among the working class remain barred from liberating economic and educational opportunities. Science and technology have largely been devoted to pecuniary, profit-making efforts that bolster the capital and extravagance of a privileged few. The technological or the techno-industrial apparatus could be put to better use. Wealth and prosperity could be shared more equitably. Poverty and ignorance are neither inevitable nor necessary. In short, Dewey argues that our ideals do not match our political practices. He argues that if we truly believe in the enduring values of the French Revolution, that is, if we champion liberté, égalité, and fraternité, we could alter our ends in view, our practices, our political policies, and our political institutions so that regular folks are afforded three things regardless of class. Regardless of class, creed, race, and sex. First, regular folks should be afforded liberty, the freedom to make decisions about their own lives as autonomous agents. Second, they should be afforded equality, the access and opportunity to those social goods that facilitate the development of individuality. And third, they should be afforded fraternity, the ability to work together with others cooperatively to address the concerns and issues of the day. Hence, Dewey issues a call for democracy as a way of life, or better, democracy as a moral ideal. We are prodded to create communities, social institutions, and political policies that embody faith in the individual's ability to live autonomously, faith in the intentional programs and structures that help the rank and file members of society develop into reflective agents, faith in cooperative efforts to ameliorate pressing problems. Now, decolonial philosophy may have more to say about such matters. There are many scholars doing this work, and I will mention that I'm partial to Sylvia Winter, Maria Lugones, and Vandana Shiva. Decolonial philosophy, as I understand it, is a reaction to colonial projects that arise out of Western Europe in the late 15th century. In concert with the Renaissance, advances in mechanistic science, fissures in the Catholic Church, and burgeoning mercantilism, colonial projects were undertaken, driven by various motives, imperialism, mountains of gold, cheap resources and labor, and or vacant tracts of land lying waste. These Western European colonizers brought with them ontologies, logics, and ways of categorizing the world. Strict categorical dichotomies were imposed on the foreign populations. One is then man or beast, civilized or savage, Christian or heathen, male or man or woman. A culturally biased conception of the human being, or anthropos, is imposed. A European well-born aristocratic Catholic man is depicted as the representation of anthropos. You can maybe imagine Vitruvian man in the background. Sylvia Wynter terms this man one. By this logic, if one does not qualify as man one, then they require paternalism, redemption, or pastoral guidance. In the subsequent centuries, with advances in science, the Protestant Reformation, and additional colonial projects, the conception of man takes on a new guise. In the 18th century or thereabouts, a bourgeois white heterosexual European Protestant is depicted as the bearer of inalienable rights. This man is depicted as what it is to be human. Wynter terms this man two. Those who do not qualify as man two require development or discipline or medication. The larger claim is that we in the contemporary world, including the global South, still speak the languages of these colonial projects. We still tacitly bear some of the same categorical dichotomies. We still see the white supremacy, the heteropatriarchy, the techno-industrial standards, the capitalist impulses. Put another way, the Declaration of Independence was written for man too. Now, if we circle back to Dewey and his assessment of what's wrong with the United States in the 20th century, I hope you see that the Dewey account does not question various aspects of Euro-American coloniality. This is not meant to dismiss Dewey or Deweyan philosophy, but to provoke scholars to extend the discussion to the transatlantic slave trade, the dispossession and erasure of indigenous peoples of North America, the gendered and racialized geographies that we have been instituted and maintained, and the assumption that the techno-industrial order of things is the standard by which we should measure cultures. Section 2, education and changing human nature. In Freedom and Culture, Dewey asserts that, quote, democracy needs a new psychology of human nature, end quote. Full disclosure, this talk of creating a new human nature has long confused me. I think I've read too much Aristotle. Human nature seems to reference some quality or trait inherent to human beings, in essence. But that's not what Dewey means. Returning to Dewey for this occasion, I noticed that Dewey devotes a section of human nature and conduct to changing human nature. Moreover, I was prompted to think about this text and this larger problem in relation to education. So I take a small detour. In Talks to Teachers, William James describes the young pupil as a subtle little piece of machinery. Quote, a little sensitive, impulsive, associative, and reactive organism, partly fated and partly free, end quote. By learning the physiological urges and needs, the psychological mechanisms that structure perception and apperception, teachers are better able to capture the attention of the student and mold their native impulses into more efficacious acquired impulses. On such a view, education is the replacement of native impulses with acquired impulses. And this is where we get new habits of conduct. In Human Nature and Conduct, Dewey offers a similar description of education and the ways in which impulses are molded and remolded to build better modes of conduct. Strikingly, Dewey argues that new acquired impulses will be integral in the changing of human nature. So let us return again to Dewey's critique of the American money culture and its proclivity towards acquisitiveness, the profit motive, and capitalist impulses. Many still claim that human beings are by nature greedy, self-serving beings, that human beings are inherently exploitative, zero-sum thinkers. Here, Dewey is trying to highlight how others have tried to rationalize the economic disparities and the social hierarchies prevalent in the modern world. If we as a species are hardwired to exploit one another, then it would seem that inequity and hierarchy are inevitable. It'd be natural. To be clear, Dewey wants to dismiss the notion that human nature is set in stone or bound to some immutable essence. Rather, Dewey suggests that human beings are impulsive beings who are habituated into cultural patterns. Often these habits harden into custom. Native human nature supplies the raw materials, but custom furnishes the machinery and the designs. But notice the role of impulses. Impulses free us from custom. Dewey writes, quote, impulses are the pivots upon which the reorganization of activities turn. They are the agencies of deviation for giving new directions to old habits and changing their quality, end quote. As I see it, Dewey turns the discussion of human nature toward impulses and the motives that drive action. He notes, quote, thus far, schooling has been largely utilized as a convenient tool of the existing nationalistic and economic regimes, end quote. Education systems have replaced native impulses with acquired impulses aimed at conserving and maintaining a capitalist techno-industrial order of things. But there are untapped resources in education. Dewey writes, there are possibilities resident in the education of the young, which have never been taken advantage of, end quote. The young, especially, are key. They have not yet yielded to established custom. There we find impulsive activity, vivid, flexible, experimenting, and curious. Education, then, should work to retain some element of the impulsiveness of the youth. We should not trade one rigidity for another. Rather, we should instill habits that remain somewhat flexible, experimental, vital. Dewey writes, quote, what is necessary is that habits be formed which are more intelligent, more sensitively percipient, more informed with foresight, more aware of what they are about, more direct and sincere, more flexibly responsive than those now current, end quote. It would seem then that older, more rigid motives and customs should be replaced with fresh, more vital motives. Our impulses could reach out towards democracy as a moral ideal, rather than working to maintain the prevalent system and its profit motive. And what about the coloniality that lurks in our intervening background assumptions in the United States and abroad? Could we rework this Deweyan picture so that it addressed the Euro-American coloniality that undergirds our present order of things? I'm thinking that the change would have to be much more radical than what most Dewey scholars consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. I think my talk will link well with what you've started to say about education, and the ending was, now I'm stuck in suspense. I guess it's a Dewey in suspense, but like it needs to be more radical. Okay, what? Yes, okay, so that, but great, thank you. And you kept in time, so I know you couldn't tell us exactly what we're supposed to do next. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my slides and see what happens. Let's see. Allow Zoom to share my screen. Okay, sorry, just one moment. Apologies. It might just take 1 second. It's just telling me I have to quit Zoom. I apologize, in order to share my screen. I'll be right back.
Does anybody have any questions that are more for clarification than general discussion while we're waiting for Andrea?
I just wanted to say that both of these first two talks are just wonderful.
I really appreciate, Jennifer, your comments on Aristotle, because I've always, sort of thought about the virtue ethics kind of thing and understood the differences, but had trouble just, putting it into words that seemed to capture it pretty simply. And I think you did that in about 4 sentences. I was really quite
Oh, thank you very much.
grateful for that. I mean, it's
Yeah. I read human nature and conduct as a kind of commentary on Aristotle, and I think I agree with Jennifer that takes it a little bit too far, and they're going to have to split the difference.
Okay, let's hope that was worth it. Sorry about that.
Andrew's back. Hooray.
Okay, let me see if it will work now, and if not, I will have to do this without slides.
it's doing it.
Okay, can you
There you
see
go.
that? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great, and I can see you. Wonderful. Okay. So my talk is entitled Dewey, Existential Uncertainty and Educative Growth, Reflections on the Moral Dimension of Experience. And I am trying to change the slide. There we go. Okay. So why uncertainty? Well, we might, as Dewey scholars, be very comfortable with the idea of uncertainty, but when we ask ourselves, or most people ask themselves what it's like to be uncertain, it could conjure up feelings of anxiety or worry. Uncertainty can imply a calling into question or even an undoing of something we were certain about. As such, it can be coupled with a sense of unsettledness or feeling lost, something we want to avoid. But yet, for Dewey, uncertainty has educative, even moral value. So I want to discuss First, a recurring figure in Dewey's works, including in Human Nature and Conduct. And you will find this in particular in the start of chapter 15. And even though he deals with these kinds of reflections on various terrain of moral experience, as I will call it, in many of his works, I'll use the language from Human Nature and Conduct that he uses. So he talks about a person who's marching on, giving no attention to his path nor his destination. This person, we might say, is in the mode of habit, of routine, just following the smooth flow of experience. However, this person might be pulled up, arrested, experience the shock and confusion of something unexpected coming into the situation, perturbation and uncertainty, in fact. And for that moment, at least, the person does not know what hit him, nor where he was going. So we might imagine, as Dewey tells us in another work, that we're on unsure footing in this situation. And it's also something that he calls the indeterminate situation that we fall into. Now, there's something else then that happens where we begin to see definite things. We start to make sense of the situation. We relate, the person relates to where he was going, where he was trying to go, or sees indications of a new path. And we call this identifying a problem. And in many of his works, for example, A Theory of Inquiry, Dewey talks about this as a problematic situation. So what I want to focus on in this talk is the indeterminate situation, and specifically the moral dimensions that it has. I should say briefly that this talk is part of a larger discussion that I'm involved in on non-affirmative educational theory, with a paper coming out in a Springer volume on non-affirmative education and Bildung. And I will have a slide on that at the end of the talk. But in sum, the lens of non-affirmative educational theory, following the work of Dietrich Benner, offers us a way of differentiating affirmative from non-affirmative forms of teaching, where affirmative forms of teaching aim to educate the younger generation to affirm the existing order or an imagined order by the educators themselves. And non-affirmative forms of teaching aim to educate the younger generation towards the development of capacities to critically participate in an ongoing discussion of how the future should be shaped. So the first part of this is going to be around uncertainty and learning, specifically understanding that indeterminate situation as the beginning of learning and moral learning included. While Dewey recognized that problems are important to learning, he took issue with the idea that problems are the starting point of learning. This is at the heart of Dewey's well-known critique of traditional education. He was critical of traditional education, or transmissive teaching, as we might call it, which provided learners with ready-made problems. Ready-made problems are those predefined, pre-formulated before the learner is involved in the situation, and we might see this in practice as pouring in prepackaged knowledge. And so what happens is, however, Dewey's interest lays in how we as human beings arrive at a problem in the first place. How do we arrive at problems is meaningful if educators are to be able to refrain from imposing established problems onto learners as ones the learners should have, or worse, from presenting established problems as if they were the learner's own. So as a way of summarizing his critique, we can say that in transmissive traditional situations, the learner has no generative power in the situation. Just as the learner does not grow, so too the ideas as meanings and connections that are part of socially communicated understandings do not grow. Another way of putting this is that in the traditional approach, the teacher's interactions with the learners do not initiate learners' reflective transformative learning experiences. And those, as we know from Human Nature and Conduct and other works, are the purpose of indeterminate situations. When habits are broken down or interrupted, that can inspire reflective inquiry. So in other words, these kinds of interactions do not cultivate what Dewey called growth, or in the German term Bildung, where self and world are in interplay and both transform on account of such interplay. What I note as the central fallacy of the traditional transmissive approach to education is that it places no value in theory or practice on the human experience of limitation as constitutive of learning processes. They don't attend to limit experiences, as I will refer to them, those experiences that make us question what we know or are able to do. And so Dewey provides a recurring example of an infant trying to reach an object that's too far, just out of his reach, and getting that moment of confusion, of doubt, of what's wrong. These moments are experienced as discontinuities in learning and breaks or interruptions in the smooth flow of experience. So bringing us into that indeterminate situation. A similar example from my own experience with my own child is the idea that when my daughter was learning to stand, she saw a tablecloth corner hanging from the table, pulled herself up and tugged on the corner of the cloth, and saw for a moment was in hesitation as the plastic cups began to wobble. Presumably she hadn't foreseen that might happen. So she was sat there with a face of wonder and perplexity. But such experiences, such moments of arriving at the limit of one's knowledge and ability, are just as much a part of the child's experience of free play, as Dewey would tell us, as a scientist's discovery in a lab. So the idea here is that these experiences open up a realm of existential uncertainty. The type, and this existential uncertainty is embodied. It's a feeling. The type of uncertainty we feel is not cognitive, he says, rather it's precognitive or pre-reflective. As I said, he describes it as being on unsure footing. These moments involve our whole being, and thus they can be difficult, even painful to endure. But they are educative and have moral value insofar as they make us aware of where we are within our own learning process at any given time by revealing to us what was, up to that point in time, in a certain sense hidden as a mere supposition in the form of a habit. So indeterminate situations shake up our habits, our fixed habits, and they can be conceived of as openings within our experience. So the moral import of being in an indeterminate situation is that the existential uncertainty, that embodied feeling of being disturbed, initiates thinking. It arouses inquiry. It incites reflection. Or in Human Nature and Conduct, he goes so far as to say it incites reflective imagination. And there we come to that moment of deliberation and dramatic rehearsal. And indeterminate situations cultivate the learner's freedom because they provide for a space for an original response. Freedom here is understood as the individuality of the learner's thinking within response to and perspective on the troublesome indeterminate situation. So in looking back at the examples, we might say that the learner who wanted to reach an object, the child, but is not able to, has a question arise in her mind as to why she can't reach it. On that basis, she can ask herself, what might I need in terms of resources, objects like a stick to nudge the reached for object towards me, or another person like a parent to help me. These needs are not trivial. They point to precisely what that child in that moment needs to learn. Moreover, they point to an opening for the learner's imagination beyond what is towards what is possible. And so, although it begins in direct, urgent situations of indeterminacy, reflective thinking, reflective imagination supports the moral growth of social sympathies by widening our area of vision to include what lies directly beyond our direct interests, As Dewey says in Democracy and Education, and similar passages can be found in Human Nature and Conduct. So I'm just going to skip ahead to one of the sort of formulations of growth that Dewey talks about as that can arise out of these kinds of situations. They're at the heart of what fosters open-mindedness and intellectual growth, which means the constant expansion of horizons and consequent formation of new purposes and new responses, similar to what Lee was just talking about. These are impossible without an active disposition to welcome points of view hitherto alien, an active desire to entertain considerations which modify existing purposes. Retention of capacity to grow is the reward of such intellectual hospitality. The worst thing about stubbornness of mind about prejudices is that they arrest development and shut the mind off from new stimuli. So in brief, I will draw some points about teaching and the impact of this idea of learning and experience and moral dimensions of experience for teaching and democratic education. Today, just as in Dewey's time, both transmissive traditional education, but also what we might call a reductive progressive model of teaching, pose critical threats to democratic education as a form of non-affirmative education. Dewey pointed out that the heart of the problem with these models is that they each in their own way gravely misunderstand the principles of freedom and authority in education. In transmissive environments, thinking in particular is gradually destroyed. The learner's confidence in his own quality of mental operation is undermined to a docile subjection to the opinion of others. And this is what Dewey calls as cultivating a form of parasitic dependence of one mind on another, a form of mental life antithetical to democracy. On the other hand, reductive progressive forms of teaching that leave the learner at bay to do as they will, understand freedom as release from external authority. And these can lead to a dangerous form of independence, as Dewey says. He warned that too strong a sense of personal independence often makes an individual so insensitive in his relations to others as to develop an illusion of being able to stand alone and act alone, an unnamed form of insanity, which is responsible for a large part of remedial suffering in the world. And such insanity, characterizing the narcissism of dictators, is clearly seen today in the leadership of countries that still claim to be democratic. So what does teaching look like that recognizes and values freedom? Dewey discusses the idea of the teacher as an artist, and I won't go into it too in depth as I do go into it in the paper. But teachers as artists are sensitive and responsive, able to see and hear something fresh, something not capable of being fully anticipated in the way each learner approaches and responds to the subject matter, objects, and ideas of others. They're able to see and hear each learner's expression of freedom. And ultimately, this sense of teaching and interaction and the educational system on the whole that supports it can support Rather than docile dependence or radical independence, it would support an idea of interdependence, which means for Dewey, vibrating sympathetically with the attitudes and doings of those about them. And there we find this, again, moral dimension of cultivating these moments of uncertainty and indeterminacy and what can emerge from that. Common understandings of teaching today still rely on ideas of the teacher as someone who tells. Reading Dewey through the lens of the critical tradition of non-affirmative educational theory helps draw out what is implied by Dewey's theory of democratic teaching, and yet goes beyond what Dewey himself articulated. Namely, this lens helps reframe the teacher as one who listens. On this view, non-affirmative teaching is fundamentally relational and receptive, though not passive. It has been recognized that the lack of genuine open listening is contributing to the crisis in democracy. To avert this crisis, teachers, scholars, and citizens that intend to foster non-affirmative democratic education must deeply consider how such listening is learned. I contend that when teachers genuinely listen to learners, they're listening to their full experience, their uncertainty, and their struggle. Given the vital role of existential uncertainty in learning as inciting thinking and initiating the formulation of genuine learner-dependent problems, it cannot be left to chance whether learners have opportunities to have educative experiences of existential uncertainty. Indeed, the experience of existential uncertainty is the moment where learners begin to feel a sense of possibilities that are unrealized and that might be realized. And if these possibilities are put in contrast with actual conditions, the most penetrating criticism of the latter can be made. It is by a sense of possibilities opening before us that we become aware of constrictions that hem us in and of burdens that oppress, as Dewey says in Art and Experience. And in Human Nature and Conduct, he says, to say that the welfare of others like our own consists in a widening and deepening of the perceptions that give activity its meaning in an educative growth is to set forth a proposition of political import. Finally, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that classrooms can be spaces, I believe, still for cultivating what Bell Hooks refers to as radical openness, or Maxine Greene calls moral wide awakeness, or what Leonard Wax calls apophatic listening, a deeply open empathic listening. As we move further into the 21st century, it is urgent that we answer the call to rehumanize what have been dehumanizing spaces of schools that have marginalized and silenced so many voices. To do this, I suggest that a critical question we need to ask is, how do teachers gain agency in systems that are telling them to view students as data points, as numbers, and not as human beings? Dewey's insights, and more broadly, the lens of critical non-affirmative educational theory, suggests that one starting point for teachers may be to identify just how, in the life of each classroom, the seed for situations of genuine indeterminacy can be planted and nourished. Thank you.
Let me make a couple very brief comments before we open it up. Generally, my head's about to explode. I have a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts, a lot of, oh, I should have thought about that before, long before this. But I have a couple things to say, and they're really just the same thing. The first thing is that here we are 100 years on with Human Nature and Conduct. And I think that the folks who have spoken to us this afternoon, today, whatever time, have really made a case for why Human Nature and Conduct is maybe more useful now than it was in 1922, or at least that we have language and experience of our language about our experience that would open us up to what Dewey offers with respect to this really interesting rhythm, but also paradox related to habit and reflective action, or individual agency, or whatever it might be. I really want to point to the quote that Sarah put on in the chat. By a seeming paradox, increased power of forming habits means increased susceptibility, sensitivity, responsiveness. This, even if we think of habits as so many grooves, denotes high sensitivity, and the word she first stuck in the chat, explosiveness. So we think about habituation, and yet it's the very capacity to form habits, says Dewey, that may actually fuel or activate or motivate our capacity to change by being more sensitive. I do think that I appreciate from the very beginning that we have William James speaking to this, that we have Jane Addams speaking to this. James, who reminds us always that emotion is part of this picture, however we are thinking about it, and it's in Dewey, of course, in his theory of emotion, but also in human nature and conduct. And Addams, I think, who the concrete action as a starting point for ethics remains always important. And it's important in this day and age when, frankly, you just feel like there's nothing I can do. And yet the pragmatist question always is, no, what can we do despite whatever sucks or whatever feels like it's out of our control or whatever might happen? There are things that can be done, that I can do, that you can do. What do we do that moves not towards a perfectionist kind of thing, as Jennifer reminded us, but some form of amelioration, something that is better in the next moment than it is in the previous moment. But what I heard coming out, especially in the last three presentations, but really in all of them, is the importance, as Andrea just reminded us, of the existentialist perspective that underlies the very possibility of response. And I'm thinking about continental philosophers like Levinas, or even the existential literature from Sartre and to some extent Heidegger, that put these limits on what we can do and make indeterminacy and uncertainty very much part of the life we are living and the possibilities we are facing. I think human nature and conduct gets to that. It is evolutionary, as Marilyn, these are evolutionary ideas, as Marilyn points out from the very beginning. They are neo-Humean. We've got consequentialism in there without completely ignoring the insights of Kant. But I think I was most struck by Lee bringing Sylvia Wynter to bear, because one of the things that I have always thought is that Dewey in Human Nature and Conduct and pragmatist ethics has the capacity for criticality built into it. And yet what is also true is that many of us who speak about Dewey and who speak about pragmatism generally don't explicitly go in the direction of the kind of critique that a Sylvia Wynter brings to the lived experience of the subaltern or whoever else you want, however you want to portray that. And so I'm really interested in what I think of as critical pragmatist ethics. Now, I don't know that it's all that different from what we would find from Dewey if we put together a full, with lacking the perfectionism, if we put together a full portrait. And yet I think that the willingness to explicitly, as Marilyn and others have done, call out critical theories of feminism, of neo-Marxism, of any kind of critical theories, and say, no, these are all part of the way that we can enact and understand a pragmatist ethic. So those are just some thoughts that I have had as I've been listening. They're probably not that well formed, and others can respond to that. Maybe I took somebody's name in vain or said something that isn't exactly what you said, and you can correct that now. But we're open forum. We have as much as a half hour, I think. And, you know, if you have to check out, you can, but if you want to stay and sort of wrestle with all of this stuff that's been laid out in front of us, that's going to be great. Anybody want to speak back?
I have a question for the room. I've been trying to find what I'm disappointed in Dewey's account of ethics is how we really fully understand the antisocial. How do we understand the problem of evil? How do we understand the fact that we do exploit one another all the time? And I think, I mean, I don't think he goes far enough to understand that problem, like why that happens. We are social by nature. I buy that, but yet how do we also explain the rampant antisocial? How does Dewey account for that?
So I touch upon that a little bit in the talk I gave, but I think, I mean, you have to read around 3 or 4 books, and I don't know if he goes directly at all of this, but I mean, I think he's pointing out that there's a pecuniary or greedy sort of thing, capitalist sort of thing in, at the very least, the United States, that it drives us, and he says it's almost like we have a religious devotion to it. And that whole bit about we have to have a new psychology, a new way of thinking about human nature, I think it's big for him, because I think it's so well ingrained that we think of ourselves as individualists who have to, you know, run in the rat race to try and get ahead. Right? That's so embedded in Americanness that we have to get away from that. I don't think he's saying that he has an answer necessarily, but I think that's part of what's holding us in that sort of thing, right? That our ideals don't match on to the way we actually live.
Yeah,
I think-
can I just add to that? And it's a mistake. So the thing he keeps coming back to is that what we think of as natural inclinations to be, one of the examples is greed with a small child grabbing food, or other kinds of faults in human nature, and we talk about them as if they're natural, when he thinks they're products of socialization and the social institutions that we have that pit individuals against one another, or require them, you know, encourage a partiality, say, to family, which on the one hand seems nice, but also leads to, you know, competition with other families. Well, charity begins at home, so I ought to be giving to people here. In my province, in Alberta, for example, or in Edmonton, the food banks here, when actually the food banks up north are much worse off, you know, because of the remoteness of northern Canada and how much more expensive it is for people to truck in food, or places in other countries, Pakistan during the flooding. The problem, and where he would like to get us to rethink, is to think about how institutions press us to ourselves, and through the ways we educate our children, kind of pit people against each other, class against class. You know, he doesn't talk about men and women much, but men against women, and so on and so forth. If he were alive, he would be a fan of, you know, critical race theory and saying, this is really important. We've got to understand how institutions operate and how they socialize us. So actually, the reason I think, you know, he doesn't spend a lot of time beyond worrying about trying to get us to see how our characters are formed, talking in the ways that other moral theorists do about particular individual problems, is that he actually thinks we should be focusing on social questions, on issues about how to understand how our social institutions affect us and separate us and divide us into separate publics that can't communicate with one another. And that's where we need to concentrate, rather than on individual behaviors first and foremost. I mean, yes, we have to raise our children, we have to try to be good people, but to solve the bigger problems, it's looking at the social institutions that we have to go with, including schools, of course.
I think another aspect of that answer is not found in his ethics, but rather his educational theory. And of course, they're all one in some sense in Dewey, but you know, he really does talk about the problem of society losing touch with these moments of indeterminacy that are openings, and experience itself becoming mechanical and deadening, and situations like industrialization supporting that sort of routine, fixed obedience to routine, and that deadening experience, we fall asleep to the responsiveness to what's new and what's different, and what is actually telling us that we need to wake up and, you know, treat someone differently, react differently, think differently, believe something differently, if we were actually to pay attention, which is what I, you know, I consider his notion of aesthetic experience as an answer to that problem, because reflective experience was not enough and there was no reflection. So he said, you know, well, we need genuine sensory felt difficulties and resistance in order to actually make change. And that sort of what I think possibly answers it.
Well, look, the whole planet is now at risk of implosion, and yet people don't feel the kind of uncertainty that Andrew was referring to. It's like it hasn't somehow or other gotten to them, because they can still move along at their day-to-day pace. And so, you know, I mean, we swim in the sea of capitalism, and we swim in the sea of acquisitiveness, and it doesn't bother us. I mean, it bothers, and if it bothers us so that, okay, we'll recycle, something like that. No, the magnitude of the problem has not hit us in the way that opens up a new possibility.
Yeah, that hits home for me. Talking to some of my students about, you know, what they're thinking is their future, and they want this certificate or that certificate because they think it's going to get them a job. I mean, they're still very much focused in on wanting to climb the ladder, and I mean, we all have to eat, we have to pay rent, and those sorts of things. But I'm trying to get them to critique or be critical of certain types of institutions, and a lot of them look, you know, very skeptical, because it sounds to them, I think, like you want me to be broke and not get a job and not be wealthy. And part of this, I think, is just there's a need for being creative and thinking of new alternatives, right? What actually could we do? And I don't think a lot of us even open up to that there are other alternatives out there.
I do think there is a great deal of uncertainty, however, and I think students, Lee's students and everybody else's students are experiencing that uncertainty. I think we, you know, to do a deep dive into what's going on in the world since 9/11, since you know, there were planes hit buildings in New York City and other places. There's been a sense, whether we realize it or not, or whether we acknowledge it or not, that things aren't like, we're not invincible. We're not safe, not anywhere, not in the US where we apparently thought we were, not in other parts of the world, whether it's Ukraine or whatever. And I also think that there is economic uncertainty that may be exactly what's driving the kind of feelings that your students are suggesting, Lee, and other students that I've encountered, that, you know, the only thing they know is, okay, I got to work harder. I got to do more. I got to get the right credentials or whatever it might be. And the irony is, just as they're going for these credentials, the economic world is shifting, and those credentials aren't going to matter in quite the same way. How they're going to matter, I don't pretend to know. But, you know, there are things that one can do without a a college degree. There are people dropping out. There's all kinds of uncertainty. And then the climate stuff, like, I mean, that's just craziness that we're not feeling uncertainty in the face of climate change. I was down in Florida a couple weeks ago, and seeing the destruction from Hurricane Ian was, I mean, you couldn't speak. It's so bad. And how they will respond to that, I have no idea. So I think there is uncertainty, and I think there clearly is indeterminateness. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is people trying to put lipstick on a pig to make certain. I think the quest for certainty is alive and well at an everyday existential lived experience kind of way. And that we're trying to put certainty on things that frankly are fundamentally uncertain. So, I mean, how do we get to that place where you can stay open, where you can engage in the kind of ambiguity that Dewey, I think, was willing to engage in?
Well, here I think I would put Adams and Dewey together. And Adams' question, what time is it, is enormously important. This is not 1922 anymore. And what time is it? The environmental situation has to be first and foremost as a global potential catastrophe. Adams was highly critical of the so-called founding fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and the Revolutionary War, because she said what it did was it fixed in a static way the ideals of a group of people advanced for their time in the 18th century that we have now encrusted as our conception of individualistic political democracy and individualistic capitalism. But the world has changed markedly since that time. The problem with that she sees in this notion of individualism that has so clamped itself on our country in both economics and politics is that it encapsulates the notion of force, which is anti-democratic. After all, the capitalist can force his or her workers to do as they say. And give me liberty or give me death, and I'm willing to die for it, and I'm willing to kill for it. And so our conception of democracy is based in force. And so when you have Dewey and Adams talking about democracy as a way of life, a way of association, it is the farthest thing from the ideals of the founders that this country still tries to hold on to, however badly it does. And that this whole change in our conception of economics and democracy, it needs to change in light of the question, what time is it now? And what needs to change so we can meet the challenge of this time?
Can I add? I think some of the there are some very good things going on relative to when I first landed on the planet, that we should continue to work on if things at the social level. When I was a kid in Connecticut, I was taught that there were no Native Americans in Connecticut. They had all been shipped out. There were none left. And when I was taken to a museum, I embarrassed myself in front of the docent running it. When it was taken around, it's at Mohawk, it's one of the first indigenous run museums in North America. We went around, saw the older artifacts. It was all very interesting about how people had lived. And then we came to a small section featuring people in contemporary clothes, having contemporary festivals. And I thought there's something wrong here, because I've been taught that there are no Native Americans alive. And the woman said, well, I'm Native American. Which was sort of dreadful. So I learned at that moment, I couldn't trust teachers. And I'd been really badly taught. But nobody in Connecticut would make that mistake anymore. The fact that we can even talk about colonialism in a way that we didn't talk about, admittedly, 40 more plus years ago, is a sign that things can and do change. I wish we could have a truth and reconciliation exercise in the US as we have in Canada and some other countries. They've been enormously useful. They don't solve everything, but they do enlighten people in ways that are really, really helpful. They displace some older ideas in useful ways. But these things are happening, even if it's some ways more awkward to do it in the United States than in some other places. And we have to take, keep taking the long view. These things, social changes institutions don't change overnight. They're cumbersome things. They are the equivalent of habits, the really settled, rigid habits in human psychology. And we have to keep working at them. But there are great changes, some here and there, not as many as there should be. Gay people can get married. That was unthinkable when I was a kid. Many other sorts of things like this are going on. So we have to keep focusing on the things that have worked and what made them work, come about, in order to keep pressing, for more and better kinds of changes, which again, I think is why Dewey was actually, although he wrote a lot on ethics, was actually far more interested in what we would call social and political thought and issues, because that's where he really thought, you would get bang for your buck in terms of beneficial social change.
Well, one of the things that Dewey says at the end of part 3 in Human Nature and Conduct is when he talks about religion, and he talks about the fact that, when we think about what we can do ourselves, we can be kind of struck by the fact that not too much, and that we have to have a kind of faith that there are other people working along the same lines that we're working. In Common Faith, he talks about a kind of renewed kind of ritual life, where we can, ritualize our concerns. And, we have Thanksgiving dinner where we celebrate, eating dinner with the Indians. But maybe we can think about ways that we can create, I don't mean rituals in quite that sense, but maybe something like that sense, a new kind of ritualized life where we come together in a kind of celebration and also in concern for the loss of so much of what we are losing. As professors, we can give lectures, but I think Dewey would agree that that would be about the last thing that's going to affect anything. That our forms of teaching are impotent, and that we need to think about new ways of bringing people together with a sense of kind of shared responsibility and shared concern in the way that, well, like that a Thanksgiving ritual or a mass or something like that does.
I have a question that goes in a very different direction. So tell me if I'm interrupting a chain of thought here. I was struck, Jennifer, in your talk about how you talked about different stages of life and the changes over stages of life. And it made me question how much Dewey's conception of growth is applicable across a lifespan. And I'm thinking particularly of a good friend of mine. We've been friends for a long time. She is now in her 90s. And for the past, I'd say 15 years, I have watched her world shrink as she becomes increasingly disabled, living always in pain, which increasingly becomes more intense. And certainly she has to learn how to adapt, and she has to learn what to cut out of her life. But to see her trying to do this, the word growth just doesn't make any sense at all. It's more, how do I decline without committing suicide? And so
yeah.
how can pragmatists, maybe Dewey, I don't know if he writes about old age, but how can we think about it in terms of how to think about a lifespan that includes those experiences?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting challenge, and it's a challenge that you would think people who are interested in, virtue ethical approaches would spend a little more time on than they have so far. Dewey didn't write much himself. He did write an interesting introduction in the, late 30s, I think, to a book on aging. It's a rather long introduction, and he says somewhere in there that I forget what her name is in Chicago, once asked him about, what sources on the psychology of aging could he perhaps point her to, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry, I don't know any." And she replied, "Oh, well, isn't it interesting? The one thing we all look forward to reaching, hopefully old age, is something we do no preparation for at all, and not even to understanding." And he's quite alarmed, actually, in that introduction about the increase of the population of senior citizens, for which he thinks there's no preparation. And he projects an estimate to 1980, that there'll be 3 times, the percentage of really old folks that there are now. And we don't know, we know these stereotypes about old people, that they become difficult or conservative or one thing or another, yet some people clearly don't. We don't know what's biological, what's psychological, what's cultural. So he really didn't, was sort of admitting, I haven't thought about this. I don't know. I don't think anyone really does. So it's, I guess, our job, or the job of the succeeding generations, to try to look into that and try to figure these things out. But it's in thinking about that I really did get more suspicious about Dewey's talk about growth, which has an appealing quality. The idea that, yes, as some things, as you age, or at any age, there are some things you can't do anymore. It might be for physical reasons, or it might be because you've got kids and you don't have time for that, or your job doesn't let you do that, or you have to move somewhere, or these other things. So you have to give up certain things, but you can develop new ones to take their place. If we think of growth in that terms, then even for quite, I think, elderly or disabled people who are seriously challenged, there are still opportunities of that kind. It's the language which is talking about more and more and more. That's the stuff where it becomes another one of these horrific visions of how old age is going to be nothing but failure. So eventually, I think that's the sense in which we should encourage people to keep trying to keep developing, growing, if you like, or to be resilient, I think is a term I might prefer. But at some point, just hanging on is probably both a challenge and a success. I mean, something that's impressive and admirable. But that needs a different language, I think. It's not it's not something for which Dewey developed a characterization, because he never thought about it until this very late introduction to somebody else's book. But I think it is an important challenge, because the percentage of age and seriously disabled people who can survive for a long time is going to continue to grow, and it's going to grow in places which were even less well able to accommodate these folks than developed countries like the United States or Canada. So it should be a topic of concern, I hope.
Yeah, well, Dewey's the last person to turn to here. He's breaking new ground in his 90s. He probably didn't have this experience.
I wonder if there's an aspect to his sense of growth that is not so much about whether the person can actually, continue to be as multifaceted as they were as at youth, or continue to add on, I guess, but to the position of others and how they're treated. Because we always have to, if we think about the educator-learner relationship, you always have to treat as if they have infinite amount of plasticity. The belief in plasticity has to be fundamental to your practice. So similarly with an older person who's losing capacities or dementia or other disabilities, the caretaker still has to treat them as having this inherent human capacity for growth in order to establish a relationship that is, you know, supporting integrity of the person's life till the end of days. So I wonder if there's an element to that of keeping that sense of growth for the sake of how we treat others, regardless of what circumstance they're in.
That's an interesting suggestion, and that could certainly, that puts the growth somewhere else, unless you're just talking about creating opportunities for people to explore new interests or something, which would be a good thing too. And that would probably, Dewey would say, require us to reconsider institutions again. I mean, in that introduction, he talks about nursing homes and so forth. We're going to need new forms of specialized care for these folks, and they're probably, you know, much more, if you like, educative, if we pick up on that, than are the kinds of institutions that we tend to have. Which I mean, there are some interesting experiments. Some of these, have you read about some of the dementia villages? There are a couple in a couple of countries where people live in sort of small group homes in a sort of an estate setup where they can, you know, safely live, walk around, garden, do a range of different things, which you can't do in the kinds of, you know, care homes that we have. Some of the, you know, more expensive ones will have nicer facilities in the memory unit, but even so, it's sort of nothing comparable. So we need to think about these aspects of our institutions as well, I think.
I like the turn that Andrea is suggesting. Adam's got a phrase from George Eliot, the novelist, about the bare offices of humanity, and that we need to extend to everyone the bare offices of humanity, even when they are no longer capable of doing very much at all. I worry about holding on to the notion of growth because, well, Dewey and the pragmatists talk about experience should test our theories, not that our theories should stretch so far to try to accommodate every experience. And when I look at my friend and how she was a Plato scholar, an intellectual, and most days she can't bear anything more than very light murder mysteries at this point, if that. She's not demented. But the pain is so intense that to ask her to grow any more is to show an enormous lack of sensitivity to her condition. But I think the notion of how do I grow in the way I continue to foster the relationship as she diminishes, I think that's really important.
And then to see it as a human relationship, a fully human relationship, even though the person has lost some capacities, many capacities.
Jennifer, I think you've already kind of given us the distinction in Dewey that helps us navigate this. So I always read the expansive sort of comments about growth as expansion and so on as Dewey, the educator of the young, as Dewey doing, you know, philosophy of education for K through 12 or something like that. But I do take him to be offering a kind of his Darwinianism, a sort of radical individualist account of well-being. By individualist, I don't mean atomized individualism, but judgments about well-being are deeply contextual and relational and always relative to a unfolding, you know, sort of moment in time. And so in that regard, it's anti-Aristotelian. There's no like measure of, you know, how well you're doing until you get down to what is this individual's capacities and what are the opportunities and possibilities? So I don't know, but I did find that helpful. I want to quibble with you about virtue ethics, but that seems too like fussy at this point. But I just can't help but say there's 3 independent factors of morals, and virtue is one of them. But
Yes, well,
I'll just throw that out there.
to be a virtue ethicist, you just have to hold that virtues, the moral status of the virtues is not reducible to either, you know, consequences or to notions of right. So it doesn't mean you throw those out. So you can be a very pluralistic, and that would be the kind I would support. That's why I said I could be a neo-Deweyan virtue ethicist.
I think it's about time to ask Kyle to, or perhaps Len, to bring us to some closure here.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for joining with us and participating with us and bringing some new light on a text that's, I think, very important and actually very, very fertile for our use today. And also how pleasant it is to get together with our fellow scholars and our friends and to talk about things, you know, without even having to travel and stay in a hotel. So I want to, you know, hand the mic back to Kyle and just say thank you very much to everybody for wonderful afternoon, morning, or evening, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Can we all unmute and give Len a brief hand because he was really the visionary for this. So thank you, Len.
Okay, Len.
Thank you to everyone else, our speakers today and those who were here. So have a good and safe weekend, and we'll see you all hopefully in Chicago at Joint Conference of John Dewey Society and Philosophy of Education Society.
And I will see people in SAP as well, where the John Dewey Society has a session.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care. Len.
You.